As we do each week, we're going to alternate. And so please, when you read loud enough so the person in front of you can hear and be encouraged by the word of God. I'll start on verse 1. And the Lord said to Joshua, "Do not fear and do not be dismayed. Take all the fighting men with you and arise, go up to Ai. See, I have given into your hand the king of Ai and his people, his city, and his land." So Joshua and all the fighting men arose to go up to Ai, and Joshua chose 30,000 mighty men of valor and sent them out by night. And I and all the people who are with me will approach the city, and when they come out against us, just as before, we shall flee before them. Then you shall rise up from the ambush and seize the city, for the Lord your God will give it into your hand. So Joshua sent them out, and they went to the place of ambush and lay between Bethel and Ai, to the west of Ai. But Joshua spent that night among the people. And all the fighting men who were with him went up and drew near before the city, and encamped on the north side of Ai, with a ravine between them and Ai. So they stationed the forces, the main encampment that was north of the city, and its rear guard west of the city. But Joshua spent that night in the valley. And Joshua and all Israel pretended to be beaten before them, and fled in the direction of the wilderness. Not a man was left in Ai or Bethel who did not go out after Israel. They left the city open and pursued Israel. And the men in the ambush arose quickly out of their place, and as soon as he had stretched out his hand, they ran and entered the city and captured it, and they hurried to set the city on fire. And when Joshua and all Israel saw that the ambush had captured the city, and that the smoke of the city went up, then they turned back and struck down the men of Ai. But the king of Ai they took alive, and brought him near to Joshua. And all who fell that day, both men and women, were 12,000, all the people of Ai. Only the livestock and the spoil of that city Israel took as their plunder, according to the word of the Lord that he had commanded Joshua. And he hanged the king of Ai on a tree until evening. And at sunset Joshua commanded that they took his body down from the tree and threw it at the entrance of the gate of the city, and raised over it a great heap of stones, which stands there to this day. Just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded the people of Israel, as it is written in the book of the law of Moses, an altar of uncut stones, upon which no man has wielded an iron tool, and they offered on it burnt offerings to the Lord and sacrificed peace offerings. And all Israel, sojourner as well as native born, with their elders and officers and their judges, stood on opposite sides of the ark before the Levitical priests, who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord, half of them in front of the Mount Gerizim, and half of them in front of the Mount Ebal, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded at the first to bless the people of Israel. And altogether, there was not a word of all that Moses commanded that Joshua did not read before all the assembly of Israel, and the women and the little ones and the sojourners who lived among them. This is the word of the Lord.
A couple of weeks ago, I was able to tick off a significant milestone in my life. I submitted my final assessment for a Bachelor of Theology at my Bible college, and it's been a 5-year journey balancing both ministry commitments as well as full-time study. And there are many reasons why I feel like this journey was quite special, but one particular reason that I want to share with you today is that this was not my first time attempting a bachelor degree. After high school, I went to uni for 3 years until I dropped out without completing my degree. All I have to show for it is a large HECS debt. And so now, many years later, I've been given this other opportunity. I've been given a second chance to study, to complete this degree, and it's something that I'm thankful for. It's something that I recognize came at a great cost. I've been able to learn from my past mistakes and try my best to avoid making them again. And of course, second chances aren't just limited to university degrees. Let's think about the many opportunities we've had to restore, reconcile, mend a broken relationship. Or what about the many job postings? We've applied for many. We haven't heard back, but out of one of them, we hear and we're able to get a position. All of these are different opportunities for us to learn from our previous experience and change our behavior accordingly if necessary. And in our passage today that we just read together, we see something similar happening as well. In chapter 7 of Joshua, Israel lost what should have been a very easy victory, but we found out that God caused them to suffer defeat because one member, Achan, he failed to follow the instructions given and he stole from God. But here in chapter 8, we read that Joshua and Israel, they're given another opportunity, another chance to face the city of Ai in battle once more. And so as we make our way through the passage, I've divided it into 3 sections. And so section 1, new instructions. Section 2, victory. Section 3, the mountain. Section 1, new instructions. Right out of the gate, from verse 1, we read that Joshua is given new instructions from the Lord. But before God tells Joshua what these specific instructions are, he tells him not to fear or not to be dismayed. And hopefully for us, the alarm bells are starting to ring. Hey, that phrase sounds familiar. Earlier in the book, in chapter 1, verse 9, God says the same thing to Joshua just before they're entering into the promised land. They're ready to conquer it. And so Joshua and Israel, they're still in the quite early part of their journey, and they have a lot of fighting to do. And of course, it's a great comfort to hear from God, okay, you're going to face many more cities, you're going to have many more battles, do not be afraid, do not have fear. But I think there's a particular reason why God mentions this again to Joshua today. Israel and Joshua have witnessed what happened to Achan at the end of chapter 7. They know that it was his sinful actions that led to their demise. And so I imagine it's not very easy for them to prepare for battle once more with all of that in mind. Doubt and uncertainty can creep in. What if there is something else that God is unpleased with? Something that we're not aware of, and we lose again. The first loss, it was heart-melting. But if we were to lose again, it would be soul-crushing. And so God assures Joshua and Israel that this would not be the case. We see in verse 1 that he has told him that the city of Ai, the king, the people, the land has been given to Israel. And with that in mind, Israel is to prepare there to go back into battle with Ai once more. But they're not to repeat the same tactics, the same instructions that they did before in chapter 7. We read that they spied out the land, they sent 3,000 men, and they thought that they would win. But no, in verse 1 and 2, we see that there are 3 new instructions. And the first is that they are to take up all the fighting men. The second is that they are not to fight them head on, but they are to set up a trap. And the third thing we see is that they're to destroy Ai, just like they did to Jericho, except this time they can take the spoils and livestock. And at this point, we might be asking, why is there a change from Jericho? It was only a few battles, it was just one battle ago. Why not give the exact same warning? And I think it's because God is testing something particular here. God is testing Israel's ability to obey his word. And so if we recall the events of chapter 7 and the events of Achan and him stealing the things, and that was what led to their demise, we're raised with this different question. Israel are given a slightly different set of instructions, and how will they respond? Have they learnt from their past sins, or will they steal and lie against God once more? But the good news that we read is that Joshua and Israel have seemed to learn their lesson. In verse 3, we're told that all of the fighting men go up to Ai, and 30,000 are sent at night. We will notice that this is 10 times more than their first attempt. And you can imagine what a soldier might be thinking at this time. Someone who is experienced in war, someone who has fought many battles. 30,000 seems like a little bit of overkill. If it wasn't for Achan, our first battle, sending 3,000, we probably could have won. And so now, why do we bother with the whole entire army? Why not try the same tactic as before? And isn't this the way that we often find ourselves thinking as well? We're in a situation that we've faced 1,000,000 times before, and what is our first reaction? What might be our gut instinct? To trust our experience and to do what we think is right. And of course, God has given us brains to think, to learn. But if we're always approaching a God-sized problem with a human-sized solution, I think we're setting ourselves up for failure. And so what we ought to do is to approach every situation, yes, utilizing the gifts, the resources that God has given us, but ultimately we're to approach him in a humble posture, relying on him. We will notice that the soldiers don't think this way. They obey. And even though they are men of war, and humanly speaking, what God has instructed them to do might seem a bit silly, they obey. The warning has stuck. Israel have witnessed firsthand what happens if they go against God. And so with all the men ready to fight, they're ready to set the trap. And here is the plan. Here is the city of Ai. Some of the men, the fighting men, they will hide behind the city. Joshua will go with another group. They will pretend to engage. But just before the men of Ai and Bethel, they come to fight, Joshua's group, they all run away in defeat. The men of Ai will think, oh, okay, we've won again. And they're feeling confident from their recent victory, and they're going to chase Joshua's group, and the city is left defenseless. The men who are waiting, who are hiding in ambush, they will be able to take over with little to no resistance. And tactically speaking, I think this seems like a better plan than the first attempt. You know, Israel has a much bigger army than before. They're making use of psychological warfare. They're taking advantage of Ai's overconfidence, and they're using that for an easy victory. But this strategy, this new set of instructions, is not the reason why they win. And so let us look at verse 18 as we head into section 2, victory. In verse 18, God tells Joshua, "Stretch out the javelin that is in your hand toward Ai, for I will give it into your hand." Was the city empty at this point? Yes. Was the trap effective? Yes. Did every man in Ai and Bethel fall for it? Yes. And so on the one hand, we don't want to minimize the actions of the soldiers, nor the cunningness of this strategy, but this victory was clearly a result of God giving the city into their hands. And again, we can imagine how tempting it might be for the soldiers, after seeing this plan work so successfully. They think to themselves, yeah, that's right, we're the best. Ai is no match for us. But no, we don't see any of that. The men who were in ambush, they diligently carry out their tasks and they quickly burn the city. They know firsthand that if God is not with them, if God wants Israel to lose, He will make them happen. And no amount of soldiers, no stratagems will ever accomplish victory. And so the men of Ai find themselves in a precarious situation. They're in the wilderness. The men, Joshua and his group, they're out in the wilderness. The men in ambush, they come and they launch a pincer attack. And we're told in verse 22 that all the men of war who came out were killed. The king is spared, but later he will be killed and he'll be hanged on a tree. And then once the soldiers have been dealt with, Israel returned to the city to destroy the rest and kill the remaining citizens. So all the soldiers have died in the wilderness. The city remains. It's filled with women, presumably children, maybe the elderly. And you would think that as the soldiers are coming back to the city, they're thinking, hey, maybe we can take it a bit easy. Anyone who poses a risk to us, anyone who is a threat, they've already been eliminated in the wilderness. But no. Look with me at verse 26. Joshua did not draw back his hand with which he stretched out the javelin until he had devoted all the inhabitants of Ai to destruction. You know, Joshua and Israel have been given another opportunity to defeat Ai. You know, Joshua and Israel, they do not think to themselves, hey God, you helped us out in the beginning. You know that tactic to lure them into the wilderness, to lure them into a false sense of security? Oh, that was perfect. You know, chef's kiss. But we'll take it from here. Even when the victory is pretty much guaranteed, even when the city is left defenseless, Joshua continues to outstretch his hand. Ironically, the kind of hand that would be used to kill his enemies, he keeps it outstretched, and he acknowledges that the victory belongs to God. In another part of the Old Testament, in Exodus chapter 17, we see a similar thing happening. Israel is fighting with the Amalekites, and neither side is able to prevail over the other. And so Moses, the leader of the nation at the time, he stands on top of a hill and he has a staff. And in that account, we're told that as long as Moses lifted up his staff, that Israel would prevail. But if he would grow tired and he would put his hands down, the Amalekites prevailed. And the picture that is painted here with both Joshua as well as Moses, this one of dependence, this one of outstretched arm, is to show that they are not trusting in their own military might. And now that the victory has been accomplished, all the men, all the women, all the inhabitants of Ai have been destroyed, we're able to proceed to section 3, the mountain. In Deuteronomy chapter 27, which was read at the beginning of our service, Moses, he commanded the new generation that when they cross over they cross the Jordan River into the promised land, that on one particular mountain, Mount Ebal, they are going to set up an altar, and here they're going to make offerings, and here they're going to write the law on the stones. And so when Israel and Joshua reach there, they do all that Moses has commanded. I think there should be a picture. If you look on the screen, maybe if we can just zoom in, towards the bottom, scroll down, we'll see there is the city of Ai. And to its north, past Shiloh, we'll see there are the two mountains that were referenced in Deuteronomy chapter 27, Mount Ebal, Mount Gerizim, where the nation of Israel were to stand. We're in the beginning of the book of Joshua. There is still a lot of fighting to do. There is still a lot of land that needs to be conquered. And yet only after the second military battle, Joshua decides to lead Israel there so they can fulfill what was commanded in Deuteronomy chapter 27. As you saw from the map, it's a bit of a detour. And we might be thinking, why not wait until they conquer a closer city, killing two birds with one stone? But I think Joshua chooses this particular moment precisely because of what has happened at the first time with Ai. They suffered a humiliating loss. And worst of all the other nations, they mocked and dishonored God's name. Sin had gotten the better of Israel. Israel was supposed to be God's representatives to the world, his covenant people. And yet what happened? They broke faith and they desired the things that were devoted for destruction. Israel forgetting all of this was what led to their eventual downfall. But we see in this passage, in God's great mercy, he's given them another opportunity to redeem themselves, to defeat Ai, and Israel do everything according to the word of the Lord and are victorious. And so if you ask me, now seems like the best time to go and offer sacrifices and read the words of the law together. Now seems like the best time to be reminded that they are the people of God who belong to the Lord. Now seems like the best time to listen to God's voice and keep his commandments. God had given Israel another opportunity, and they did well to learn from the past and change accordingly. Friends, aren't second chances great? Isn't it comforting to know that our initial failings, they don't have to mark us, they don't define the trajectory for the rest of our lives? That sometimes we're afforded another opportunity. Could you imagine if I turned up On the first day of my Bible college, I sat down with the principal, and he said to me, holding my transcript, my past experiences, what I've been doing, "Charles, I'm sorry, but we're going to have to say no to you. It says here that back in 2010, you went to uni, you failed some subjects, and you did not finish your degree. Don't you know that you only get one shot, one opportunity to go to university? And so sorry, that's a no from us." But obviously, that was not the case. I was able to enroll, I was able to complete my studies, and not only that, I was able to take some of the life lessons that I'd learned from my first attempt and apply that to my time at Bible college. And now that I've just recently finished, the first question on a lot of people's mind is, okay, so what's next? Will you do more studies to be an ordained minister? And the honest answer is not anytime soon. I'm a little bit tired, and I think I want a bit of a break. And as appreciative I am of this opportunity to pursue further studies, the truth is, with each iteration, with each new time that I do something, the amount of study and effort required still remains a difficult task. It's not as though just simply having a new opportunity, a second chance to take what we've learned from the first attempt and apply that to the new one suddenly makes everything easy. A surgeon who has done a routine procedure 1,000, 10,000 times, they don't walk into the theater all casual. They still need to focus. They still need to concentrate with every new patient. Because no matter how many times they've done this procedure, there are things that are still difficult. Throughout the book of Joshua and the rest of the time that Israel spends living in the Promised Land, they encounter countless different scenarios. Some are very similar. Today we saw the Battle of Ai. We read of the Battle of Jericho, and there were some overlaps, some similarities, but some differences as well. Some are very unique, a one-off event. But with each and every opportunity that Israel encounter, there is the responsibility, the onus on them to keep God's commands. And isn't it true that obedience is a difficult task no matter how many times we've done it in the past? It doesn't matter how many times we've learned from our mistakes. It doesn't matter how convinced we are that obedience is a good thing. That if I were to listen to this person, if I were to follow God's rules, the next time still proves to be difficult. And I'm not even talking about the kind of obedience that God demands in His law. Because if we're talking about that kind of obedience, it's not just difficult, it's impossible. Even if we lived the rest of our lives and we were afforded an infinite number of opportunities to perfectly grow in our obedience, in our response to God's commands, the truth is that we are unable. This is the gap between our holy God and sinful human beings like ourselves. And so if this gap is ever to be bridged, we don't need another opportunity. Despite what our world may say, that if you just have one more shot, if you have one more opportunity, you can chase your dreams, you can accomplish whatever you set your heart to. No, we need a mediator. We need someone who can perfectly obey all of God's commands. We need someone who can perfectly satisfy the wrath of God. And this person can't just be the best person to have ever lived and walked the earth. Because so long as they remain only human, 1,000,000 billion years, 1,000,000,000,000 opportunities is never enough to bridge that gap. And so this person, this mediator, they need to be more than just human. Yes, they need to take on the full nature of man so that they can die, they can be our representative. But this person, this mediator, they also need to retain their divinity so that they can perfectly obey the Father. This person, this mediator, is our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, second person of the Trinity. Friends, God has given us so much more than just another opportunity to pull up our bootstraps, to grit our teeth, and that we can try to earn our salvation. God the Father, in His great mercy, knowing that we, no matter how many opportunities we get, no matter how long we live, would never be good enough to perfectly obey all of His commands, gave God the Son to be a ransom in our place. And so, friends, soon we will get ready to respond in prayer and song. But before we do so, I just want us to spend some time reflecting over today's passage. For those of us sitting in this room, thinking that how we live day to day doesn't really matter because Jesus, He's my pal, He's forgiven my sins, I would implore you to think again. Our passage today would warn you to think again. Because even though God had given Israel the victory, they were not idle. They obeyed. They responded. They devoted the city to destruction. And in the same way, Jesus' sacrifice does not mean that we can make a habit of sin. He has redeemed us at great cost to Himself. He has given us a new life, a new opportunity, that we no longer have to follow the patterns of this world, but are able to live for Him. But there might also be some of us sitting in this room thinking, you know what, if you really knew the things that I did, if you truly knew how big of a mess my life is, you wouldn't say that. I've been given so many second chances, so many new opportunities, and for the life of me, I keep stuffing it up. I'm beyond hope. Well, friends, the good news of the Bible is that God the Father, He does not need His children to be perfect. In fact, He knows that we can never be good enough. And so what He did was He sent His Son to be our ransom, to be our mediator. And He promises that those who call upon His name and believe that He rose from the dead, that they will be saved. They will no longer be marked by their past life. They will have a new life, another opportunity to live in light of Him. And so, church, why don't we spend a few minutes in prayer, in reflection, and then the praise team will come up, and then we'll get ready to respond in song, and then I'll come back to close us in prayer.